The sterile tang of disinfectant usually clung to the air in the teaching hospital observation gallery overlooking Autopsy Bay, a scent I'd grown accustomed to, almost fond of. Today, however, it seemed particularly sharp, cutting through the low hum of the ventilation system. I leaned against the cool glass, arms crossed, my gaze fixed on the meticulous work unfolding below. A senior medical examiner, a woman with precise hands and an even more precise temperament, was demonstrating a cranial examination to a group of residents. I appreciated the quiet discipline of the space, the ordered reduction of complexity into understandable components. It was a kind of sanctuary for me, a place where the chaos of human existence was laid bare and systematically catalogued, stripped of its emotional noise. My own task was less immediate, more academic. I was reviewing some older skeletal trauma cases, cross-referencing my notes with the examiner's reports, looking for subtle patterns that might have been missed in the initial rush. The faint click of my pen against the pad of paper was the only sound I made, a counterpoint to the hushed murmurs of the residents. I preferred these quiet moments, the slow, deliberate unfolding of a puzzle, to the often unpredictable clamor of a live scene. My mind worked best when allowed to roam unfettered, connecting disparate pieces of information, building a coherent narrative from bone fragments and tissue samples. The sudden, jarring buzz of my phone in my pocket was an unwelcome intrusion. I fumbled for it, my fingers clumsy against the cold metal, nearly dropping it before I managed to answer. "Thomas here," I said, my voice a little rougher than I intended, a subconscious reaction to the interruption. "Thomas, it's the detective." The voice on the other end was clipped, urgent, familiar. "We have something unusual. I're going to want to see this. Peat Bog, north of the county line. Remote, utterly isolated. They've pulled out a body." My brow furrowed. A body from a bog isn't unheard of, detective. Preservation varies, of course, depending on the acidity and anaerobic conditions. I found myself lecturing slightly, a habit I tried to suppress, especially with the detective. He tolerated it mostly. "This isn't just preserved, Thomas," the detective interjected, his voice dropping to a near whisper as if sharing a secret. "It's perfect, like they just went to sleep yesterday, but it's not yesterday, and there are details, strange details." My academic detachment began to fray, replaced by a prickle of professional curiosity. "Perfectly preserved." I repeated, the words tasting foreign on my tongue. True bog bodies were rare enough, but perfect was a superlative I almost never applied to human remains. It implied an absence of the usual degradation and almost impossible stasis. "When do I need me?" "Now. The scene's secured, but the weather's turning. We need my eyes on this before anything else shifts." I mumbled a quick agreement, already pushing away from the glass. The residents below were still absorbed in their lesson, oblivious to the abrupt shift in my own trajectory. I didn't bother with goodbyes, simply gathered my bag, already picturing the drive, the desolate landscape of the northern bogs. My mind raced, trying to anticipate the unique challenges this find would present. Dating would be critical, of course, but also the manner of death. Bog preservation could obscure so much or, paradoxically, reveal details that would otherwise be lost to time. The drive was long, stretching into the late afternoon. The familiar urban sprawl gave way to rolling farmland, then to increasingly wild, untamed moorland. The sky, which had been a clear, indifferent blue, now sagged under the weight of bruised, heavy clouds. Rain was imminent. The air grew colder, thick with the damp, earthy smell of the countryside. My car, usually a quiet sanctuary, felt small and vulnerable against the vastness of the approaching bog. Finally, the road dwindled to a muddy track, barely wide enough for one vehicle. Flashing blue and red lights pulsed through the mist ahead, a beacon in the gathering gloom. I parked behind a police cruiser, the tires sinking slightly into the soft ground. A uniformed officer, mud-splattered and shivering, directed me with a terse nod towards a cluster of figures gathered near a roped-off section. The ground squelched under my boots with every step, sucking at the soles. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, decaying vegetation, and something else, a faint metallic tang I couldn't quite place. The detective, a man whose face was etched with years of grim discoveries, met me at the perimeter. He looked tired, his gaze fixed on the excavation site. "Tell me what I have." Local farmer found it, thought it was a tree branch at first, then saw the hand, been working with the archaeological team to extract it carefully. He gestured towards a shallow, water-filled depression. "They've done a good job, considering." My eyes followed his hand, and there it was. It was undeniably human, yet utterly unlike any other remains I had ever encountered from such an environment. The skin, though discolored to a deep, leathery brown, was intact, taut over the musculature. Fingers were clearly defined, nails present. It was less a body, more a perfectly preserved artifact, pulled from the depths of time. My breath hitched, a purely involuntary reaction to the sheer impossibility of it. I knelt beside the stretcher, oblivious to the damp seeping into my trousers. My eyes scanned every visible inch. I reached out a gloved finger, barely brushing the exposed skin of the forearm. It felt surprisingly firm, almost rubbery. "Unbelievable," I murmured, more to myself than to the detective. "This isn't just bog preservation, this is an anomaly." My gaze traveled upwards, noting the position of the head slightly tilted. Then I saw it. Reveal/discovery, around the neck, almost hidden by the matted hair and the collar of the rough tunic, was a thin, intricately braided cord. A hangman's knot, but one with an extra, almost decorative twist, a flourish that served no practical purpose beyond, perhaps, a signature. It was too precise, too deliberate for a simple garrote. Just beneath the jawline, where the cord had cinched tightly, was a faint, perfectly circular indentation. It was small, no larger than a pea, and it was too symmetrical, too perfect to be accidental. It was as if something had been pressed into the flesh with immense force, leaving behind a stark, unnatural mark. This wasn't just an ancient bog body. This was something far more recent, far more deliberate, and that knot, that faint, specific indentation. A forgotten memory, a ghost of a detail from another case, one I had never truly solved, flickered at the edge of my consciousness, an icy whisper in the gathering gloom. The tension in the air was suddenly suffocating, tied in a constrictor knot. My breath hitched, a faint, almost imperceptible sound in the quiet hum of the bog, a constrictor knot. It was a utilitarian knot, designed for securing, for gripping, for tightening its hold under tension. Not typically found on ancient bog bodies unless it was deliberate. An execution, perhaps. My mind immediately started cataloging, discarding, and recataloguing possibilities, even as the cold seeped deeper into my bones. This wasn't a casual fastening. This was precise. The excavation was a slow, meticulous dance against time and the encroaching decay of exposure. Every flake of peat, every fragile fiber of clothing, every brittle bone fragment was carefully documented, photographed, and bagged. I worked alongside the field anthropologist, a quiet woman with sharp eyes, offering direction, explaining the subtle indicators of ancient trauma versus post-mortem damage. The process took hours, stretching into the twilight, the air growing crisp and carrying the damp scent of soil and decaying vegetation. The body, once freed from its earthy embrace, was a fragile testament to millennia, yet the constrictor knot around its neck spoke of a violence that transcended time. Transporting the remains was another exercise in extreme caution. I oversaw every step, ensuring the delicate specimen was stabilized, its form supported to prevent further damage. My thoughts were a turbulent storm of questions, each one circling back to that knot, that undeniable sign of intent. It gnawed at me, a persistent itch behind my eyes. The next morning found me in the teaching hospital observation gallery overlooking the Autopsy bay. The sterile air, scrubbed clean of the bog's earthy tang, felt alien, almost too clinical. I stood at the reinforced glass barrier, my hands clasped behind my back, watching the scene unfold below. The bay itself was a brightly lit expanse of gleaming stainless steel and white tiled walls. The air conditioning hummed, A low, constant drone, and the fluorescent lights cast a stark, shadowless glow on the figure laid out on the examination table. The medical examiner, a no-nonsense woman with hands that moved with practiced efficiency, was already at work. She wore blue scrubs and a surgical mask, her eyes the only visible part of her face, narrowed in concentration. A junior assistant meticulously recorded measurements and observations. My colleagues, a detective with a perpetually furrowed brow and a quiet forensic technician, stood nearby, taking notes, their expressions a mix of professional detachment and morbid curiosity. From my vantage point, I had a comprehensive view. The bog body, now stripped of its remaining sodden garments, appeared even more ancient and vulnerable under the harsh light. The features were indistinct, flattened by the weight of the peat, but the overall form was remarkably preserved. "All right, Thomas." The medical examiner's voice crackled through the intercom system that linked the gallery to the bay. "External examination first. Any initial thoughts on the overall condition?" I leaned into the microphone, my voice clear and measured. "Beyond the exceptional preservation, I'm particularly interested in the neck. The cord, as you can see, is still in situ." Her gloved fingers, deft and precise, gently probed the area. "Yes, the fiber cord, it's surprisingly intact, and that knot. A constrictor, wouldn't you say?" "Precisely," I confirmed. "It implies a specific intent, not a simple tying. It's designed to tighten under pressure." The detective below shifted, his gaze fixed on the body. "So, you're saying this wasn't accidental drowning?" "The evidence is mounting against it," I replied, my eyes scanning the body for other signs. The skin of the neck, though shrunken, showed a faint indentation where the cord had bitten into it over centuries. But something else caught my eye, something subtle, almost imperceptible in the dim light of the bog, glaringly obvious under the clinical illumination. "Hold on," I interjected, leaning closer to the glass. "Look at the hands, specifically the nails." The medical examiner paused, directing the assistant to zoom the camera on the victim's left hand. The nails, though discolored and brittle, were still present. But look at the right hand, specifically the knuckles. There's a slight abrasion even through the preservation. The medical examiner gently manipulated the right hand, turning it slightly. Indeed, on the back of the hand over the knuckles was a small, flattened area of disturbed tissue, barely visible. It wasn't a deep wound, more like a scrape. "And now look at the feet," I continued, my voice gaining a certain urgency. "The soles, are they intact?" She examined the feet, moving with care. "Yes, remarkably so. No significant damage or punctures." My mind was racing now, connecting these disparate details. A constrictor knot implying intent. A slight abrasion on the knuckles as if from a struggle or impact. A speck under a fingernail. And intact soles of the feet. This wasn't a person who had accidentally fallen into a bog, struggling to climb out. This was something else entirely. The lack of significant damage to the soles of the feet suggests the individual wasn't walking barefoot over rough terrain prior to death. I explained, my voice tight. And the abrasion on the knuckles, combined with the constrictor knot. It paints a picture of restraint, perhaps a struggle, but not necessarily a prolonged one in the bog itself. My gaze traveled back to the constrictor knot, then to the face, or what remained of it. The subtle details, the calculated precision of the death, were screaming at me. I had seen this before. Not the bog, not the specific preservation, but the method. The deliberate, almost ritualistic violence designed to leave just enough evidence to tell a story, but not enough to easily identify the perpetrator. It was the same unsettling signature, the same meticulous, almost forensic understanding of how to kill and how to conceal, leaving behind a breadcrumb trail that only someone looking for it would recognize. My stomach clenched. This was too close. The killer, it seemed, had returned, or perhaps had never truly left. The acrid smell of the bog still clung to my clothes, a cloying reminder of the cold, wet earth, but it was quickly being overwhelmed by the antiseptic bite of the teaching hospital. My mind, however, remained trapped back in that dismal pit, replaying the grim tableau. The journey from the peat bog had been a blur of flashing lights and hushed urgency, the detective's grim silence mirroring my own churning thoughts. White walls, polished linoleum, the distant hum of machinery, a stark, clinical world away from the primeval swamp. I navigated the labyrinthine corridors with practiced efficiency, my destination etched into my memory. Finally, I pushed through a set of double doors marked with restricted access warnings and stepped into the teaching hospital observation gallery overlooking the autopsy bay. The gallery was a cool, quiet space, elevated above the main floor, encased in tinted glass. From here, the autopsy bay below spread out like a stage, brightly lit and meticulously arranged. Stainless steel tables gleamed under powerful lamps, instruments lay in precise rows, and the air, filtered and recirculated, still carried the faint metallic tang of organic decay. A few figures in scrubs moved with practiced efficiency around one of the tables. My gaze, however, locked onto the centerpiece. There it was, the peat bog victim. Even from this distance, through the thick glass, the body retained an unsettling aura. The skin, still mottled and discolored from its long interment, had a peculiar waxy sheen. The constrictor knot, now clearly visible around the neck, stood out in stark relief against the pallid flesh. I leaned closer to the glass, pressing my palm against the cool surface, my breath fogging a small patch. The detective, a burly man whose usual boisterousness was subdued by the gravity of the scene, stood below, talking quietly to the pathologist. He glanced up, caught my eye through the glass, and gave a curt nod. I didn't acknowledge it. My focus was absolute, piercing, trying to decipher the language of the dead. I pulled a small pair of binoculars from my kit, adjusting the focus until the scene below snapped into sharp relief. The knot, my breath hitched. It wasn't just a constrictor knot. It was the constrictor knot. The precise number of turns, the peculiar way the running end was tucked, the specific gauge of the cord, it was identical. A signature, unmistakable. Then I moved the binoculars to the victim's head. The face was still largely unrecognizable, but the bone structure around the occipital region, where the skull meets the spine, was now clear. There, just as I remembered, was the telltale pattern of blunt force trauma. Not a random impact, but a series of small, precise fractures, radiating outwards from a central point, almost like a starburst. It was a unique injury, one I'd only ever encountered in a single, frustrating, unsolved case. No, it can't be. But the evidence screamed otherwise, every detail meticulously replicated. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a similar methodology. My mind reeled, snatching at fragments of the past. The victim's family, their faces etched with a grief so profound it felt like a physical blow. The pressure, the dead ends, the gnawing certainty that I had missed something vital. The shame of failure, a bitter, lingering aftertaste that had haunted my professional life for years. I had pored over every detail, every angle, every piece of evidence, and still the killer had vanished, leaving only questions and a trail of meticulously placed clues that had led nowhere. Thomas. The voice of a colleague, Dr. Ramirez, startled me, the one from. She trailed off, sensing my discomfort. Yes, I confirmed, my gaze sweeping back to the body below. The one they called the Knot Weaver. The nickname had always felt inadequate, almost dismissive of the meticulous, almost artistic brutality. But the location, a bog, that's entirely different from the previous victims. Dr. Ramirez gestured vaguely towards the bay. And the preservation. A calculated diversion, I interjected, my mind already racing, piecing together the new elements with the old. Or an evolution. He's learning. He's adapting. He knew what the bog would do, how it would preserve, how it would delay, how it would complicate. The implications hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a re-emergence. This was a direct challenge. The killer wasn't just repeating himself, he was escalating, demonstrating a terrifying understanding of forensic science, using it as a weapon. He knew I would be called in. He knew I would recognize his handiwork. He knew I had failed before. This wasn't just about the victim on the table, it was about me. My hands tightened into fists. This time there would be no mistakes. This time, I wouldn't let him slip away. This time, the knot would be unraveled and the weaver exposed. The sterile hum of the air conditioning was a thin veil over the morbid tableau unfolding below. I stood in the teaching hospital observation gallery overlooking the autopsy bay, my grip tight where I gripped the cool metal railing. The glass between me and the medical examiner's table felt like a flimsy barrier, not just to the procedures, but to the chilling implications that had clawed at me since the bog. He knew I'd be here. He wanted me here. The bay itself was a brightly lit, almost clinical stage. Below, the medical examiner, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and sharp, focused eyes, worked with an assistant. The unique preservation of the peat bog victim meant the usual decomposition odors were absent, replaced by the faint, antiseptic tang of the hospital and something else, a faint, earthy sweetness that clung to the body even after its journey from the field. The body, now stripped, lay under the harsh fluorescent lights, its skin a mottled, leathery brown like ancient parchment. I watched, my mind already racing ahead of the medical examiner's instruments. My eyes scanned every inch of the victim, searching for the telltale signs, the signature I knew had to be there. This wasn't just a reenactment of the old case, it was an evolution. The killer hadn't just repeated himself. He'd refined his craft, demonstrating a terrifying understanding of forensic science, using it as a weapon, a means of communication. He wasn't just committing murder, he was engaging in a dialogue, and I was the intended recipient. My gaze lingered on the victim's hands, still remarkably intact, the fingernails surprisingly clean. No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. The killer had been meticulous, controlled. Too controlled. It spoke of a predator who wasn't just powerful but patient, methodical. The sort of individual who understood the intricate dance of decomposition, the subtle clues left behind and how to erase them. Or, in this case, how to manipulate them. The medical examiner began her external examination, dictating her observations into a hanging microphone. Her voice, slightly muffled through the glass, was calm, professional. She noted the incredible state of preservation, the absence of overt trauma, the lack of clothing. All things I'd already observed at the scene. But I was looking for something deeper, something only a mind attuned to the nuances of forensic counterintelligence would notice. My thoughts drifted back to the cold case, the one that haunted my quiet moments. The similar modus operandi, the bog, the bizarre preservation. But that victim had been found with a small, almost imperceptible floral arrangement tucked into a cavity, a macabre flourish that had baffled us then. What was the flourish this time? What was the killer's message now? The medical examiner, after completing the external survey, made a careful incision down the victim's sternum. The assistant worked to retract the skin and muscle, exposing the rib cage. The air in the observation gallery seemed to thicken with unspoken tension as the internal examination began. This was where the real secrets would lie. My eyes narrowed as the medical examiner paused, her gloved hand hovering over the thoracic cavity. She leaned closer, her brow furrowed. She then gestured to her assistant, who brought over a specialized light and a pair of fine forceps. The medical examiner carefully probed, her movements precise, almost surgical. Event. She extracted a small, translucent object from the mediastinum, nestled perfectly between the lungs, almost invisible against the surrounding tissue. It wasn't organic. It was a tiny, perfectly formed glass sphere, no bigger than a pea, and within it, suspended in a clear liquid, was a single, perfectly preserved human tear duct. My breath hitched. A tear duct, not a flower. A tear duct. The sheer audacity, the anatomical precision required to harvest such a delicate structure, to encase it, and then to implant it so meticulously within the victim's chest cavity was staggering. This wasn't just a signature. It was a statement. The medical examiner held the tiny sphere up to the light, her face a mask of professional astonishment. Her assistant murmured something, her voice too low to discern, but her posture conveyed her shock. Reveal/discovery. I knew with a terrifying certainty that settled deep in my bones what this meant. This killer wasn't just knowledgeable about forensic science. They were an academic, a master, perhaps even a teacher of it. The tear duct, perfectly preserved, suspended in its miniature glass sarcophagus, was a deliberate, almost didactic display. It was a challenge to our methods, a taunt to our understanding of the human body and its decomposition. It was a direct, personal message to me. He wasn't just preserving bodies. He was preserving evidence of his own twisted genius, designed to be found, designed to be studied. The tear duct wasn't just a trophy. It was a carefully curated piece of forensic counterintelligence. It screamed of a mind that understood the exact mechanisms of post-mortem changes, the limitations of standard autopsy protocols, and how to circumvent them, how to play with them. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The precise placement, the choice of a structure so small, so often overlooked, yet so profoundly symbolic of emotion and grief. It was a calculated intellectual game. He wasn't just killing, he was lecturing. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was a direct intellectual confrontation. The killer wasn't just cunning, he was a highly intelligent adversary using my own expertise against me. He understood the very fabric of forensic investigation, and he was weaving his own narrative, daring me to unravel it. The tension in the gallery, previously just a hum, now felt like a taut wire, vibrating with the killer's unspoken challenge. And I, Thomas, was ready to meet it. The fluorescent hum of the teaching hospital observation gallery overlooking Autopsy Bay felt like a physical weight on my shoulders. Below, the body, now stripped of its peat shroud, lay on a gleaming stainless steel table. Its leathery skin, the peculiar amber hue, the remarkably preserved features, they were all starkly visible under the harsh surgical lights. I watched, my fingers tracing the cool glass, as the pathologist, a meticulous woman with sharp, observant eyes, made the initial external examination. Still seeing a ritualistic killing, Thomas. The detective's voice, a low rumble, cut through the quiet. He leaned against the railing beside me, his arms crossed, a skepticism etched around his mouth that I knew all too well. Or is it just a very old body that happened to fall into a bog? The preservation is unusual, yes, but not unheard of for a bog body. I replied, keeping my gaze fixed on the scene below. What's unusual is the method of death, the positioning, the specific items found with the body. It's too deliberate to be accidental. Deliberate or coincidental, Ira suggesting this is connected to my cold case. He didn't say the name, didn't have to. The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air between us. The one you couldn't solve. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. The similarities are too strong to ignore. The ligature marks the lack of struggle, the specific type of ligature. And now this incredible preservation, seemingly designed to obscure crucial evidence. My voice was firm, but inside, a familiar tremor of doubt began to stir. There was I seeing patterns where none existed just because of my past failure. There was I projecting my own unresolved trauma onto this new victim. The thought was corrosive, a direct attack on my professional integrity. The pathologist below carefully measured the dimensions of the skull, her gloved hands precise. She then turned her attention to the neck, gently parting the matted, preserved hair. It wasn't a simple strangulation. The killer had used a specific technique, one designed to be both effective and leave minimal forensic trace. He knew what he was doing. He understood decomposition, preservation, and how to manipulate a crime scene. The killer is intelligent, I stated, more to myself than to the detective. He understands forensic science, perhaps even better than we do. He's using it against us. The detective grunted, or it's a copycat, or Ira overthinking it, Thomas. We've got a body, a potential cause of death. Let's not invent a supervillain just yet. His words, blunt and dismissive, scraped against my already frayed nerves. Supervillain. He made it sound like I was grasping at straws, spinning fantastical theories to avoid the mundane truth. But this wasn't mundane. Nothing about this victim, this bog, this killer was mundane. I had to push past the doubt. This wasn't about me. It was about the victim. Below, the pathologist called out a measurement to her assistant, her voice muffled by the thick glass. He was now examining the victim's hands, carefully scraping under the fingernails with a tiny spatula. My gaze drifted to the victim's feet, still partially covered by the ancient, preserved garments. The killer had gone to such lengths to create this tableau, this perfect preservation, almost as if he wanted the body to be found but not understood. Then I saw it. A faint, almost transparent discoloration, no larger than a pinhead. It wasn't a bruise, not a wound. It looked like a minuscule stain, a subtle deviation in the otherwise uniform amber brown of the preserved flesh. I leaned closer to the glass, straining my eyes. It was partially obscured by the edge of the ancient fabric, easily missed unless I was specifically looking for something out of place. It was too small, too insignificant to be a deliberate part of the killer's elaborate display. A flicker of light, a spark of recognition, ignited in my mind. This wasn't part of the grand plan. This was a mistake. "Wait," I murmured, my voice barely audible. The detective looked at me, a question in his eyes. I ignored him, my focus entirely on the tiny mark below. It was a faint, almost crystalline residue embedded in the very top layer of the preserved skin. It looked granular. Peat bogs were anaerobic, acidic, devoid of the very elements that could cause such a specific, almost crystalline deposit. It was alien to the environment, a foreign intrusion. This wasn't a flaw in the preservation. This was a flaw in the killer's perfect execution. He had thought of everything: the ligature, the positioning, the choice of environment for optimal preservation. But he hadn't accounted for this. He hadn't accounted for a tiny, seemingly irrelevant detail that now screamed modern contamination. The killer had made a mistake. A small, almost invisible mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. This wasn't an ancient body, or at least, not entirely an ancient body. This was something far more intricate, far more sinister, and I had just found the first crack in his meticulously constructed facade. The game had just changed. The sterile hum of the ventilation system was the only sound that truly penetrated the thick glass of the teaching hospital observation gallery overlooking the autopsy bay. Below, bathed in the harsh, unforgiving glare of surgical lights, lay our Bog victim. Even from my vantage point, several stories up, the body retained its unsettling, almost artistic preservation. The medical examiner, a no-nonsense woman with a perpetually tired expression, was methodically working through the external examination, assisted by a younger colleague who moved with practiced efficiency. I leaned against the cool glass, my arms crossed, a knot of frustration tightening in my stomach. The detective's dismissive words still echoed in my mind, an irritating drone that threatened to derail my focus. Supervillain. He made it sound like I was lost in fantasy, chasing shadows when the truth was likely far more pedestrian. But he hadn't seen what I'd seen. He hadn't felt the meticulous intent behind every detail of that scene, the chilling precision of the killer's craft. Nothing about this was pedestrian. My gaze swept over the scene below, taking in the array of instruments laid out on stainless steel trays, the medical examiner's gloved hands moving deftly. They were documenting, measuring, sampling, all the standard procedures, and all, I suspected, precisely what the killer had anticipated. This wasn't just about disposing of a body, it was about presenting a puzzle, a taunt. I focused on the victim's skin, the most striking feature of bog bodies. It was a deep, earthy brown, almost leathery in texture, stretched taut over bone in places, surprisingly supple in others. The natural acids and anoxic conditions of the bog had worked their slow, remarkable magic, transforming flesh into something akin to tanned hide. But as I watched the medical examiner gently rotate an arm, exposing the underside, a detail snagged my attention, pulling me out of my brooding thoughts. It was subtle. So subtle, in fact, that I almost dismissed it as a trick of the light, or perhaps just another variation in the natural preservation process. The skin on the underside of the forearm near the elbow crease seemed different. It wasn't the dull, matte finish I'd expect from naturally tanned skin. It was almost polished. My brow furrowed. I leaned closer to the glass, pressing my palm against the cool surface as if to somehow sharpen my vision. I'd spent decades studying decomposition, natural preservation, and the myriad ways the environment interacts with human remains. I'd seen hundreds of images of bog bodies, examined several up close. Their preservation was a testament to nature's unique chemistry, a slow, patient process. But this sheen, it felt unnatural. I mentally scrolled through my internal library of forensic knowledge. What could cause that? It wasn't adipose, not with this level of desiccation. It wasn't post-mortem staining, which usually presented as more diffuse. It was localized, almost a coating. Then it hit me. A sudden, jarring clarity that pushed all other thoughts aside. The killer wasn't just relying on the bog. They were aiding it. They understood the science of preservation, perhaps even better than I'd initially given them credit for. They hadn't just placed the body, they had treated it. I recalled a niche paper I'd read years ago, an obscure study on experimental accelerated tanning techniques for biological specimens, trying to mimic the effects of bogs in a lab setting. The paper had mentioned specific organic compounds, complex tannins, some naturally occurring, some synthetic that could enhance the process, speeding up the cross-linking of collagen fibers, creating that distinct leathery texture. And some of those synthetic compounds, under specific conditions, could leave a residue, a faint, almost imperceptible film. My gaze darted back to the medical examiner, who was now meticulously examining the victim's hands, the fingers curled and rigid. It wasn't uniform across the entire body, which explained why it hadn't been immediately obvious. It was most pronounced in areas where the skin had been under slight tension, or perhaps where the compound had been applied more heavily or less thoroughly absorbed. This wasn't just the bog doing its work. This was the killer's signature, etched into the very fabric of the victim's preserved flesh. They hadn't trusted nature enough, or perhaps they had a specific timeline in mind, a deadline for their macabre masterpiece. They wanted perfect preservation, or at least a specific type of preservation. And in their hubris, in their attempt to outsmart nature, they had left a trace, a tangible link, not to the bog but to the outside world, to a chemical supplier, to a laboratory, to an industry that dealt with such specialized compounds. This wasn't just a bog body, it was a chemically enhanced, artificially accelerated bog body. My heart didn't pound, it hummed, a low, intense vibration of adrenaline and focused energy. The killer was intelligent, yes, but they were also human, and humans make mistakes. This wasn't a supervillain. This was a meticulous, calculating adversary who had just shown me their hand. I grabbed my phone, my fingers fumbling slightly in my haste. I needed to get down there now. I needed to tell the medical examiner to swab those specific areas, to analyze them for synthetic tannins, for any compound not indigenous to that particular bog. The killer thought they had created an untraceable, perfectly preserved enigma, but they hadn't. They had merely given me a new kind of fossil to read, a chemical footprint that led directly out of the bog and into their world, and I intended to follow it. Even from my vantage point, several stories above, the scene was stark, clinically precise. The pathologist, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, moved with practiced efficiency around the stainless steel table. She wore a blue surgical gown, her hair tucked neatly into a cap, her gloved hands already making the first, careful incisions. I leaned against the cool glass, my arms crossed, watching. The detective stood a few paces behind me, a silent, imposing shadow. We hadn't exchanged more than a few clipped sentences since arriving. My focus was entirely on the body, on the story it was beginning to tell. The bog had preserved her with an eerie grace, but now, under these lights, the layers were being peeled back, literally and figuratively. The pathologist began with the external examination, dictating her findings into a microphone suspended above the table. I listened, catching snippets through the gallery's audio feed. Skin remarkably intact, leathery consistency. Hair reddish-brown, matted. No obvious signs of external trauma. I saw her take samples, meticulous swabs and scrapings. My mind was already racing, comparing this initial data to the cold case, to the fragmented images of that other victim, whose story had ended in a very different kind of preservation. The similarities were subtle, almost imperceptible to an untrained eye, but they were there, a certain intentionality in the state of the remains. Then came the Y incision. The pathologist's scalpel glided with terrifying ease, revealing the underlying musculature, the ribs. It was here in the deeper tissues that my attention sharpened. She paused, leaning in closer, her voice dropping to a lower register. Internal organs, surprisingly well preserved. Lungs show evidence of water aspiration consistent with drowning, but she straightened, adjusting her glasses. There's an unusual discoloration here, superficial to the pericardium, almost a crystalline sheen. My breath hitched. A crystalline sheen. I'd seen it before, or rather, I'd read about it, lectured on it. It was rare, indicative of a very specific, almost archaic preservation method. I pressed a button on the intercom panel beside me. "Pathologist," I said, my voice cutting through the sterile hum. "Can you take a closer look at that sheen? Perhaps a scraping for immediate analysis. Specifically, I'm thinking about certain mineral salts. Natron, perhaps." A momentary pause below. The pathologist looked up, her gaze meeting mine through the thick glass, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Natron," she repeated, her voice skeptical but intrigued. "That's an ancient Egyptian mummification agent, unlikely to be found naturally in a peat bog." "Exactly," I murmured, more to myself than to her. "But if it's there, it changes everything." She nodded slowly, a professional curiosity overriding her initial doubt. A lab assistant quickly prepared a slide. Minutes later, the pathologist was peering into a microscope, her brow furrowed. "Remarkable," she finally announced, her voice echoing through the gallery speakers. "Microscopic examination confirms the presence of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate crystals, consistent with a natron-like compound, and not naturally occurring here." The air in the observation gallery grew heavy, thick with unspoken implications. The detective shifted beside me, the slight rustle of his jacket the only sound. This wasn't just a murder. It was a carefully staged, scientifically informed act of preservation. My mind reeled, pulling together disparate pieces. We'd attributed it to environmental factors, a fluke. But what if it hadn't been a fluke? What if it had been an earlier, less refined attempt at the same technique? This killer wasn't just smart. They were operating on a level of forensic knowledge that bordered on the academic, perhaps even historical. Natron. It wasn't something I stumbled upon in a DIY crime manual. It spoke of meticulous research, a fascination with the cessation of decay, with the manipulation of the human body beyond mere death. It implied a killer who understood chemistry, decomposition, and perhaps even the limitations of modern forensic investigation. "This isn't random," I said aloud, my voice low, directed at the detective but really a declaration to myself. "This is deliberate. This person knows forensic science probably better than most of us. They understand preservation, the interaction of chemicals with organic matter. They want to control the narrative of decay itself." The detective grunted, his gaze fixed on the body below. "So, we're looking for a chemist, an archaeologist, a mortician, or someone who studied all of them," I countered, my mind already sketching the profile. "Someone with access to rare knowledge, possibly rare materials. Someone who views death not just as an end, but as an opportunity for an elaborate, twisted display. This isn't about hiding the body, it's about presenting it, like a macabre exhibit." The tension in the room ratcheted up a notch. They had learned from their earlier attempts, and now they were leaving a signature so specific, so arcane, it felt like a personal message. A challenge. My determination hardened. I had failed once. I wouldn't fail again. This killer, with their perverse mastery of preservation, was no longer an unknown entity. The sterile hum of the air conditioning in the teaching hospital observation gallery overlooking the autopsy bay was the only sound for a long moment. It was a sound I'd grown to associate with the hushed anticipation before a revelation, a quiet prelude to the cold, hard truth. Below us, the autopsy bay was prepped, instruments gleaming under the fluorescent lights, a stainless steel table waiting like a surgical altar. But today, the focus wasn't on the body. It was on the living, breathing puzzle pieces gathered around me. I stood by the thick glass, my reflection a pale, determined ghost superimposed over the empty bay. The detective was to my left, his usual gruff demeanor softened by an unusual stillness. To my right, a colleague, a specialist in organic decomposition from another university, fidgeted with the cuff of his jacket. He'd been brought in as an external consultant, ostensibly for a final review of my findings on the Peat bog victim. But I knew better. I'd arranged this meeting, a calculated gamble. "Thank I for joining me," I began, my voice steady despite the slight tremor in my hands I fought to suppress. My gaze flickered to the colleague. He met it, a polite, almost dismissive smile playing on his lips. He was sharp, I'd always known that. Too sharp, perhaps. I wanted to walk through some of my final conclusions regarding our Peat bog find. There are anomalies that require a broader perspective. The detective grunted, a sound of impatience, but he remained silent, trusting my lead. I pulled up a series of high-resolution images on the large monitor mounted to the wall, displaying cross-sections of the victim's preserved tissues and bone. As we all noted, the preservation was exceptional, unprecedented even for a bog body. The adipocere formation, the tanning of the skin, it's a textbook example of natural mummification. Almost. I zoomed in on a microscopic view of the victim's femur, but it wasn't entirely natural. The peat itself, while acidic and anoxic, didn't account for the full spectrum of preservation we observed. Specifically, the cellular integrity in certain areas, particularly around the major arteries, was far too robust. It indicated something more than just environmental factors. The colleague leaned forward, his polite smile unwavering. Perhaps a unique microclimate within that specific bog pocket, variations in mineral content. He offered, his tone helpful, almost patronizing. I shook my head slowly, keeping my eyes on the image. I considered that. But the trace elements we extracted from these specific arterial tissues tell a different story. They showed minute, yet distinct, concentrations of a specific plant alkaloid, Sanguinaria canadensis. Bloodroot, not native to that region, nor to any known bog conditions that would induce this level of preservation. A subtle shift in the colleague's posture. The smile tightened fractionally. An interesting find, Thomas, but perhaps a contamination, a previous floral encounter. Unlikely to be contamination, given the internal concentration. I countered, my voice gaining a quiet intensity. And the quantity, while small, was sufficient to act as a potent fixative, preventing cellular decay, much like embalming fluid but naturally derived. It was a targeted application, not an accidental exposure. I paused, letting the implication hang in the air. The detective shifted, his eyes now fixed on the colleague. And then, I continued, my voice dropping to a near whisper. I went back to the old case files. The one from 12 years ago. The body found near the old quarry, the one that baffled us all with its equally peculiar state of preservation, the one I couldn't solve. The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but they were necessary. This wasn't just about the new victim, it was about the ghost of my past failure, but we missed something. Look closely, the same cellular robustness, the same minute non-indigenous alkaloid, not sanguinaria but Datura stramonium, Jimson weed. Another potent fixative, another plant not native to that specific soil, but known for its preservative properties. The gallery was utterly silent now. The colleague's face was a mask, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent, betrayed a flicker of something recognition, perhaps even a strange, twisted admiration. I adapted my method. I stated, my gaze locking onto him, no longer veiled by professional courtesy. After the first case, I understood how we, as forensic scientists, would interpret the evidence. I knew we'd look for natural causes, for environmental explanations, so I started using naturally occurring, albeit non-native plant-derived fixatives to enhance preservation, making the bodies appear to be products of their environment, meticulously mimicking natural processes. I learned from the first investigation, from my failure to identify the true cause, and I honed my craft. My voice was raw with the weight of that realization, of the years I'd carried the burden of that unsolved case. I made the bodies forensically eloquent, speaking a language of natural decay that was, in fact, an elaborate lie. The Peat bog victim wasn't just preserved, he was prepared for preservation. Just like the quarry victim, I understood taphonomy better than any of us, and I used that understanding to mislead, to mock, to ensure my victims would be found but never truly understood. The colleague's face finally cracked. The polite smile vanished, replaced by a tight, almost imperceptible curl of the lip. It wasn't a smile of defeat, but one of bitter acknowledgement. "I see the patterns, Thomas, but it took I long enough." The detective, who had been listening intently, stepped forward, his hand moving towards his belt. "That's enough, Professor." I didn't look away from the colleague. I wanted them found. I wanted us to study them, to marvel at the preservation. I challenged us, knowing we would struggle to see past the natural veneer I so carefully constructed. He didn't deny it. He simply held my gaze, a silent testament to his cunning. The air in the gallery crackled with the unvoiced understanding that had finally broken through. The game was over. I had exposed the meticulously crafted illusion, not with a confession, but with the undeniable language of the bones and tissues, the silent witnesses that finally spoke the truth. The hum of the ventilation system was the only sound in the teaching hospital observation gallery overlooking the autopsy bay. Below, the bright lights cast stark shadows on the stainless steel table where the peat bog victim lay, now meticulously cleaned of the ancient earth that had been both prison and preserver. The air in the gallery, though filtered, still carried the faint, metallic scent of disinfectant, a clinical counterpoint to the raw, organic tang that had clung to the body just hours ago. I leaned against the cool glass, my fingers tracing the invisible barrier between my world and the methodical work unfolding beneath. My eyes were fixed on the lead pathologist, a focused figure in scrubs and mask, as she carefully probed a specific area of the victim's sternum. It was precisely where I had deduced the final, fatal blow had landed, a precise, almost surgical strike designed to incapacitate quickly, silently, and leave minimal external trace. The killer's signature hidden in plain sight, just as he had intended. "He didn't say a word, I know," the detective said, his voice a low rumble from beside me. He hadn't moved from the railing since we'd arrived, his gaze as steady as mine. Not even when we read him his rights, just that same, calculating look. I nodded slowly, remembering the chilling composure. The game had been over. The meticulously crafted illusion, shattered not by a confession, but by the undeniable language of bone and bog. Below, the pathologist paused, straightening slightly. Even from this distance, through the magnifying lens of the gallery's window, I could recognize it. A sliver of petrified wood, barely larger than a grain of rice, embedded deep within the bone. A perfect match for the specific type of wood I'd identified from the tool marks on the victim's ribs, a detail the killer had believed would be lost to the bog's preserving embrace, dismissed as natural detritus. It was the final, irrefutable confirmation, the last piece of a grisly jigsaw puzzle clicking into place. A sigh escaped me, a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It wasn't just the satisfaction of being proven right. It was the profound relief of closure. That earlier victim, the one I couldn't save, whose story I couldn't fully tell. His silent accusation had haunted me, twisting every new challenge into a test I feared failing again. This time it felt different. This time I hadn't just seen the bones. I had seen the mind behind the act, anticipating its every move, dissecting its cruel logic. I'd allowed myself to step into the killer's shoes, not to empathize, but to understand the twisted brilliance. The tension of that intellectual duel had been immense, a constant thrum beneath my skin, pushing me to look deeper, to question every assumption. I remembered the early days of the investigation, the overwhelming sense of déjà vu, the fear that paralyzed my thinking. The way my hands had trembled as I first examined the Bog body, seeing echoes of the past. But then something had shifted. It wasn't a sudden epiphany, but a slow, arduous climb out of the mental quicksand. I'd forced myself to compartmentalize, to separate the present victim from the past failure, to treat each bone, each fiber, each trace as a fresh piece of information, untainted by previous mistakes. The detective cleared his throat, pulling me back. "They're taking him to booking now. Good." It was a quiet word devoid of triumph, merely a statement of fact. Justice, or at least its initial legal manifestation, had been served. Walking away from the observation gallery, the bright lights of the autopsy bay shrinking behind me, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. But it no longer felt like a millstone around my neck. Instead, it was a reminder, a testament to what I had overcome. I thought of the killer's final, unblinking stare. He had underestimated me, assuming my social awkwardness translated to intellectual weakness, that my past failure meant future ineptitude. He had used his knowledge of forensics as a shield, believing it impenetrable. But I had found the cracks patiently, meticulously, driven by a determination born not just of duty, but of a deep personal need for redemption. There would be other cunning minds, other meticulously crafted illusions. But now I felt a quiet confidence, a readiness I hadn't possessed before. I had faced my greatest fear, wrestled with my deepest professional trauma, and emerged not unscathed but undeniably stronger. The tension of the unknown would always be there, a necessary part of the work, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a challenge I was finally prepared to meet.